So today I'm going to be taking a look at the newest Dan Henry release. They redid the 1963 but made two different sizes this time and in a couple different colors. So let's get into it. We have a diameter of 39.8, we have a lug to lug of 47.1, height of about 14, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications, we're going to have the Seiko VK63 Mecha Quartz movement beating away in here. Obviously a closed case back so you can't really see it. Other than that, we have Super Luminova applied for kind of all the outer track here. As you can see, it's kind of sandwiched in there, which is pretty cool. We have a sapphire crystal there with a slight dome and an inner air coating, I believe, and 50 meters of water resistance with a regular push-pull crown. One other thing to note is this is a 12-hour GMT bezel and it clicks over every 5-minute marker. And last but not least, the watch retails for $280 direct from Dan Henry. So looking at the dial here, and we have a pretty classic chronograph style layout. 12 o'clock here is the single numeral at 12, and then just batten markers for all the rest of them. What's nice is all the hour markers are actually recessed into the dial. We have a kind of sandwich layout, which is really cool, gives a little bit more depth to the dial. In theory, gives a little bit more area for lume to be applied, which is really nice. A small detail is that the 3, 6, 9, and 12, we have these triangular markers all pointing outside of the watch. And then on the outer track here, we have a seconds track, but each second is actually broke down into another individual 5 microseconds. So that's pretty interesting. Never seen that done immensely before, but cool to see it here. We have 3 subdials here, a regular 60-minute counter there, a regular running seconds at the 6 o'clock, and here a 24-hour scale. Not super useful, but I mean, hey, at least it gives symmetry to the chronograph style. We have of course, Seiko Mecha Quartz movement in here, so when you actuate the chrono, you have that nice kind of pseudo-mechanical sweep to the seconds hand. Flies back pretty easily, lines up nicely, so no complaints there. As you can see, they kept the text basically to as minimum as they could. They literally have only Dan Henry written at the 12 o'clock, which it looks pretty clean. I don't have any problem with it. It's a very nice looking layout overall. A couple nice details on the watch is for each sub-dial, it's actually sunken in rather than just flush with the dial. Gives a little bit more depth to the watch, which is always welcome. And then each sub-dial is actually surrounded in a more metallic colored ring. It is something I kind of didn't love at first, but it does have other elements that tie in, like the more metallic rings look a little bit more matching with the actual stainless steel of the case. So not too bad of a touch, and I think it adds just a little bit more pop to the watch design other than just a blue and white color palette. And then one last thing that you'll be able to see closer when we get into the macro is the hands are done in this kind of blasted, matted finish. Makes them a little bit more grayer than shiny stainless steel, ties in a little bit better with the silver of the subdials. I think it looks pretty clean, makes it look a little bit more sporty, so not too bad. And then before we move on, I just want to say that Dan Henry did a pretty good job on just the general tone of the dial. It's a very good blue. It's not too aggressively sunburst, but it does have a nice sunburst to it when it's in direct light, so not too bad. And then zooming in on the Dan Henry, you can see that sunburst pattern a little bit more closely. As you can see, very, very fine, a nice deep, rich blue to the dial itself. So pretty well executed. And then here you can again see the depth of the sandwich dial, nice little touch. And at this magnification, you can actually tell the hands are in this kind of blasted material or blasted finish. I think it looks cool, gives a nice gray, cool tone to the watch, adds a little bit more uniqueness to it rather than just a stainless steel. I actually think it is better for legibility as well. The regular stainless steel hands maybe would have not been as visible as this kind of gray is, so nice touch. Looking around the dial, it's not perfect, as you can see with that sub-seconds track on the outside. There's a little bit of dirtiness in the brushing there. Nothing too crazy. It is nice to see at this magnification, though, that they went with concentric circling for each of the sub-dials. Just is an extra step they didn't have to take, but it's nice that they did. But otherwise, you can see there is a little bit of QC issues happening, a little bit of dirtiness within that sub-dial there. Again, more towards the outside of the sub-dial. The hands don't look perfectly finished, but I think that is just kind of the style of whatever process is applied to the hands anyway. And I don't think they look bad necessarily. No glaring kind of issues though, which is nice to see. The lumen fill actually looks packed pretty cleanly. It looks pretty uniform. and it's shining white, so it doesn't contrast with the dial, which is nice to see as well. Overall, pretty good dial, pretty much holds up under magnification. No huge mistakes or anything that I wouldn't expect at this price point. So moving on to the case of this watch, it's pretty simple but well done. We have a vertical brushing on each of the lug tops here and a kind of nice chamfer that thins out towards the base of the case and gets wider towards the very end. Nice little touch. If you look at the side case, we have a very relatively thin mid case, all horizontally polished along the actual mid case there. Slight little kind of beveling of high polish there where it kind of starts meeting the case back. Signed Dan Henry crown in high polish. As you can see, a coin edge bezel to that 12-hour GMT bezel. Looking at the GMT bezel here, it isn't the most premium feel, but what's nice is it does have a very definite click over to each of the hour markers. It doesn't kind of get stuck in between, although you can have that bidirectional motion. It very easily catches on each hour marker and lines up perfectly. So the QC here is pretty good, and it's not too bad of a bezel overall. One note about the bezel as well is this is obviously supposed to be color matched with the blue dial, and although the dial is a sunburst and the bezel was just a regular kind of stainless steel insert, it still does match, I think, pretty well with the blue tones. I was a little apprehensive at first that they wouldn't match that well, but I think it is a pretty perfect color match. Looking at the case back, pretty simple design, just a little information around the back here, sapphire crystal, limited, whatnot. And then we have this blasted case back with the Blackbird high polish relief here. Pretty cool. I mean, Dan Henry always does something special on the case back, and it looks cool. One thing I like about this case a lot in particular is that it has a lot of curvature to the lugs. They have a really huge turn down. They're fairly stubby, so they're not too long, and they're definitely not overly long by any means. And they actually come to meet a little bit below the case back, so it will sit really nicely into the wrist and pretty comfortably. Moving on to how the watch wears, earlier I was wearing my new Studio Underdog here, pretty cool little chronograph. And then we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and I think you could tell it fits pretty well. The lugs are fairly short and sit nicely within the bounds of my wrist. Again, this is a 40mm watch, and with the bezel, it cuts into the dial space a little bit and makes it seem even a little bit smaller. So it's a very, very comfortably wearing watch. Again, because of that lug curve down, it doesn't meet the wrist really well. Has a very comfortable feel on wrist too. No really digging or any harsh corners or anything like that. So it's a really enjoyable watch and case to wear. And then looking from the side view there, again, it does curve down really nicely into wrist. Any flexion is met with it just perfectly sinking in. So really no uncomfortability with this case. And then really quickly before I move on to other straps, I actually did end up getting almost all of the Dan Henry 1963 models. Obviously on this side we have the blue and black in 40 with the color match bezels, and then here we have the black dial with the steel bezel. One thing I kind of wanted to point out, if you compare the steel bezel to the regular color match bezel, is the steel bezel ends up feeling a little bit more vintage. It has a little bit more of an old world feel, while the color match bezels gives it a more modern feel, makes the dial itself and the watch itself look a little bit more expansive, while the stainless steel bezel kind of cuts down on the area. So both cool watches. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the black colorway just because the Lume itself has this kind of slight greenish yellow tint to it, which is weird because they didn't do that on the blue and they kept it nice and white. So just kind of a weird design choice, I think. I mean, it maybe leans a little bit more vintage feeling on the black, a little bit more military with that green tone, but I think it would have looked a little bit better had they kept it all white like on the blue here. And then just for comparison, here is the black dial, black bezel on wrist, and there is the black dial steel bezel. Again, I think this makes it look a little bit smaller and a little bit more vintage because of that steel bezel. And now before I move on to other straps, of course this is not the stock Dan Henry strap. If I bring in the stock Dan Henry strap that it came on, it is a nice kind of orangish brown tone with a kind of vintage style 2-stitch here. Not the worst looking strap, but the thing is they didn't make it for very short wrists. I think I'm on like the last hole and it still doesn't fit very well. And also it's a little cheap feeling and has that kind of classic cardboardy, genuine leather feel. So I would just buy another strap. And then this strap that I've been featuring it on is this King Leathercraft. I believe it's a natural Buttero leather grain. Moving on to the first strap combo, we have this nice one-piece chevron strap from Crown and Buckle. I believe this is their Oxford color. The lighter blue tones just play well with the blue dial itself, and the kind of genuine, or not genuine, but just the weave in general has a nice texture to it. Looks pretty good, fits pretty comfortably. The watch wears pretty ergonomically, so this kind of thinner NATO doesn't really add too much to the height or the bulk of the watch. Still a very nice combo. Next we have this nice mesh bracelet from WatchGecko, I believe. I don't know if they still make this bracelet, but I'm sure you can find something pretty comparable. Just kind of a classic, somewhat thicker mesh bracelet. I think it pairs really well with it, goes along with that flighty, Breitling kind of theme. So let's get on wrist. Looks pretty good, I think. Of course, Dan Harney doesn't make a bracelet himself or themselves or whatever, however you want to refer to the company. But I think this is a pretty good option, and I'm sure you can find something comparable on Amazon for like $30 or maybe strap code, something like that. To add a little bit more color to the watch, we can have this very over-the-top pink stingray from Keep Piece strap. Very comfortable stingray straps, some of the best I've tried. So try one if you like it. And there we have it. Very bright combo. Stingray adds a nice little texture to the watch. Overall, I really like it. And last but not least, we have the white Archer silicone strap off of Amazon. Very good combo, again, because they went with the whiter toned lume on this watch. I think it pairs very well, and it's a nice kind of summer feel. There we have it, super comfortable, nice and bright, makes the watch pop a little bit more, makes the white accents come out a little bit more. So really, really comfortable, really, really cool. Looking at the lume here, I think you can see we have that kind of classic BGW9 glow, that slight blue tint to it. What's really nice to see is that the hands and all the numerals and markers are pretty well matched. There's nothing that's too bright, there's nothing that's overly brighter than the other, so it's nice to see it's all even. One small detail that I didn't really notice until we actually loomed up the watch is that the 24-hour subdial has the little pointer head of it loomed. So you can kind of tell which, I guess, portion of day and night you're in, which I guess is helpful if you can read the lume and you also can't look outside, but it's there if you need it. One other thing to note is the running seconds hand. The very tip of it is also loomed, so if you wanted to time something in the dark, you could at least do that down to like a couple minutes. So that's cool, I guess. Relooming and comparing to my Timex here, as you can see the Timex is much brighter. Obviously it has a little bit more surface area, but even then the actual base brightness of it is just higher than the Dan Henry is. Not the worst application ever, but also not the best, but at least they loomed pretty much everything that they could, and it looks pretty nice. And then just as a quick comparison, we have the blue dial, blue bezel on the left, and the black dial, black bezel on the right. As you can see, because they went for that more creamish, greenish lume signature on the black dials, it has a more green lume. But also it actually ends up being brighter, which is kind of just one of those trade-offs. Either you like brighter lume, or you like your lume not to look green and yellow when it's not in use. But either way, as you can see, black dial is a little bit brighter, easier to read a little bit more, lasts a little bit longer, but not as pretty looking in my opinion. So pros and cons of this Dan Henry, and the first I'm just going to say is the size is great. I believe the old version was 42, and they still do a 42, but they also offer a 40 now, which fits amazingly well, it looks great, and I just think it is a good option to have. Another pro for the watch is the blue coloration they went for. It's just a good shade of blue. It has a lot of depth to it. It's not too overtly or aggressively sunbursty, which is always nice to see. And I just think they did well in the execution of the blue, especially with the color matching bezel, which just looks perfect. Another pro for the watch is going to be the sandwich dial. You don't see it in many watches. It's kind of just a fun addition to have. Adds a little bit of depth to the watch, a little bit more visual interest, and definitely a step Dan Henry didn't have to take, but they did for just the purpose of detail, for the purpose of giving you a good watch, and it's nice to see. And lastly, although my version didn't have a steel bezel, I think the steel bezels do add a nice vintage kind of look to the watch. The color matched bezels make it feel like a very modern, even slightly bigger, more expansive watch because it's all one color. But the steel bezels add a little bit of interest too, and I think it's also a good point that the steel bezels and the color matched bezels look so different from each other. It gives you kind of, one, either a reason to buy multiple, or two, just like a nice idea of each watch having their own feel to them. So moving on to cons, and really there aren't many for this watch. One will be that with the black dial variants, you do have that slightly more green leaning lume signature, which I just think clashes more with the dial design. It's just kind of a personal pet peeve of mine in watches whenever they have that slight green tone to the lume. It makes strap changing or strap matching a little harder. I just don't like the look of it. I think it clashes with some of the colors on the dials sometimes. I do think it's well done on the black. It doesn't look bad, and I'm glad they didn't do it on the blue because it would have looked very bad. But I wish they would have gone with the same white lume for both the blue and the black dials. My last con for the watch is the stock straps aren't that great. They do have that classic cheapy, cardboardy type leather feel to it. I would have expected a little bit more for around like the give or take $300 price point that they're at. But you can't ask everything of the watch. You can obviously buy another strap from Amazon for like 10, 20 bucks, or step up a little more and spend like $40, $50 on a strap, and it'll complement the watch much better. But it would have been nice to see them add something in the box that was a little more premium. So final thoughts on this watch, and honestly it's just a really good one. It is well priced, I think, for what you're getting. It's executed very, very well. It gives, especially if you go with the stainless steel bezels, a vintage feel without vintage problems. And at the end of the day, Dan Henrys are usually just pretty well made. It is, of course, an homage to certain things. It looks very much like chronos of that era, and it also looks a lot like Breitlings or some other chronograph like that. But at the end of the day, it's not anywhere near the price point of those. It's a little bit more modernized with the mecha quartz and all that good stuff. And it's cool for people who either want to try out that style or wouldn't want to spend that much money on that style. It's a great option for a watch collector of really any level because it's just another fun addition to the collection. The blue or the black dial, you can't really go wrong. I prefer the blue just because of the white lume, and I think just the blue is really well executed, but there really is no wrong choice. Another pretty good looking Dan Henry, and if you like the look of it, there's almost no reason not to get it, right? So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another one.